All right, welcome to the Turbulent Sixties. This is part of the History 1302 series, the Cold War series. In the 1960s was a time period characterized by the Vietnam War, by growing prosperity, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and hippies. And that kind of sets the mood for this era. The election of 1960 is kind of the kickoff of this time period. You have a young Senator John F. Kennedy from Massachusetts facing off against a fairly popular vice presidential incumbent, Richard Milhouse Nixon from California. Nixon easily won his Republican primary in this. There was no real challenge. Kennedy had a little bit more difficulty in nabbing the primary from Texan Lyndon Baines Johnson. But in this election, we're going to have probably the most important presidential debate in history. This debate was John F. Kennedy, his good looks and his media savvy, against a vice president running for president, Richard Nixon, that while he had been media savvy in the past with things like the checkers speech, he seems kind of tired and lethargic and almost like a character from a bygone day. When the two men met at this televised debate, and that's going to be important, it was a televised debate, the first presidential televised debate in history, and Kennedy showed up, and Kennedy had turned down too much makeup, the big cake makeup that you wear. He had a little bit, but he bought in his hair people, and he looked very presidential. And Nixon, being a man's man, refused almost all makeup. The big difference was Kennedy didn't need the makeup, and Nixon did. And on television, Kennedy looked youthful and energetic, and he looked like America's hope, while Nixon looked like your father's president. He looked like what he was, a man from an earlier generation, even though the age wasn't much different between Kennedy and Nixon. It appeared to be vastly different, and Kennedy was wholeheartedly accepted by the youth, while Nixon seemed to be a mainstay of the past. Interestingly enough, both men did quite well in this debate. The people that listened to the debate on the radio seemed to believe that Nixon won, while the people who watched the debate on television overwhelmingly said that Senator Kennedy had won the debate. This is seen as the turning point of this election. It was a very highly contested election. Kennedy ended up winning the popular vote, by about 0.17% of the vote. So it was very, very narrow in the popular. But he did win 303 to 219 in the Electoral College, putting John F. Kennedy in the presidency in 1960. The name given this time period is Camelot, a hearkening back to the most popular musical of the day, Camelot, and the story of the young, beautiful Guinevere and her king, King Arthur, and it felt a lot like John F. Kennedy and his beautiful, beautiful wife, Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy. Let's remember that Kennedy was the youngest man ever elected president of the United States, not the youngest man ever to serve. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt is the youngest ever to serve when he became president upon the assassination of McKinley. But Kennedy is going to be the youngest ever to be elected. And it gave the youth of America this feeling of prosperity, of victory, I guess, over their elders. Kennedy's appointments were the best and the brightest. He scoured the Ivy Leagues, mostly Harvard graduates, to find members of his cabinet, the most famous of which was his own brother, Robert Kennedy, who was Attorney General of the United States. He was the nation's top cop. Today, I think presidents would be attacked for that, and Kennedy was to an extent. The idea of rewarding your family member, your brother especially, with a job. but at that time period it was a little more acceptable. And Robert Kennedy had that same kind of gravitas that his brother John F. Kennedy did, so much so that he's almost going to ride that into the presidency himself a few years later. Robert Kennedy is going to be a very active attorney general, going after organized crime in a really, really big way. And that's going to be pretty controversial because a lot of people believed that organized crime through their friends in the Union had actually helped Kennedy win the essential state of West Virginia, which put him over the top for the presidency. Robert McNamara is going to be Secretary of Defense in this time period, which was an interesting choice. Robert McNamara was not a military man. He wasn't following the typical pattern of let's go find a general, somebody that's got the experience to do this. Instead, he came out of Ford Motor Company. And the thought here was what we really needed was a businessman, somebody that knew how to read a ledger and make decisions for the best of the budget. And Robert McNamara was that guy. That may have contributed to his what most people would call his poor management of the Vietnam War. Kennedy called his own platform the New Frontier. This is a quote that came from his 1960s acceptance speech, where he said, "We stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of the 1960s, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils, the frontier of unfulfilled hopes and unfulfilled threats. Beyond that frontier are uncharted areas of science and space, unsolved problems of peace and war, unconquered problems of ignorance and prejudice, unanswered questions of poverty and surplus." Man, don't you wish presidents still spoke like that? What Kennedy was doing here was he was saying the 1960s are a time of hope and that there's change around the corner. He was selling us on a hopeful future. The amazing part of this is that Kennedy did all this with a fragile Democratic majority. Yes, he had control of Congress, but let's remember that the Democrats were not all liberal Democrats in the vein of a John F. Kennedy. There were still many conservative Democrats, particularly in the South, that were just as likely to vote with the Republican base as they were with their own president. He was a master at managing this, or balancing this pendulum between the conservative and liberal wings of not just the Democratic Party, but Democrats and Republicans. So what all did this president do? This was a president that for the first time in history said it's as important to wage peace as it is to wage war. Now that may sound silly, but he developed something called the Peace Corps, which gave college-age people a way to participate in our government and be good citizens without picking up a machine gun and rushing off to Vietnam or invading Cuba. Still around today, if you're ever interested, you can join the Peace Corps and you can go wage peace in the name of the United States. Kennedy also launched the space race, and to do this, he pushed a bunch of money into education, particularly into math and science, to raise our scores. This worked tremendously, and our education system became the envy of the world, at least on math and science. He passed a general tax cut bill. He cut tariffs by 50%. He increased the minimum wage. All of this was going on with the goal of funding this space race against the Soviet Union. I want you to think for a minute about what Kennedy said. Kennedy said during his administration, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth." Now, what you have to realize is that when Kennedy spoke those words, we had no idea how to do this. And he said, within a decade, we're going to put a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth. This is quite an accomplishment. This would be like a president today saying that by decade's end, we were going to cure cancer or cure the AIDS virus. It's something we have no idea how to do, but we're going to dedicate ourselves to it. and the U.S. did it. Now, Kennedy himself didn't see it. Kennedy's dead before it happens, but Kennedy's the man that puts it in place. The Vienna summit happens in June of 1961 between Nikita Khrushchev and the newly elected President John F. Kennedy. They met to discuss such issues as disarmament and what was called the Germany question. What do you do with a partitioned Germany? Almost immediately, Khrushchev felt somewhat insulted by Kennedy, who he saw as a youthful, much too inexperienced person to deal with. The Germany question, or the Berlin question, has to do with the partitioning of Germany after World War II. East Germany was communist and kind of a satellite country of the Russians, while West Germany was a free market economy dominated by the U.S. along with England and France. But between 1945 and 1961, 2.7 million East Germans had left East Germany for West Berlin. As a result, the Soviet Union, to try and stop this mass immigration, built the Berlin Wall. In response to this, the growing militarization of the Berlin Wall, President Kennedy gave a speech in West Berlin on the American, British, French side of the Berlin Wall, where he gave a beautiful speech that was actually played over the wall into East Germany, where he told Mr. Khrushchev, he told the premier that this wall was a danger. The words he used were "Ich bin ein Berliner," which loosely translated means "I am a Berliner," or "we are all Berliners, we're all German." Kind of a funny side note, a Berliner is also a dessert in Germany, and some people translated this as "I am a jelly donut." While we largely associate the Vietnam War with the 1960s, it was Eisenhower's war. Eisenhower had gotten us into the Vietnam War on the side of the French colonial power there, and in the 1960s, Kennedy is kind of stuck with it. He's saddled with Eisenhower's war. Not wanting to be the first president to lose a war, he starts looking for these doctrines of flexible responses. He starts developing options outside of massive retaliation. We started using things like special forces, Green Berets. We made a sharp increase in the number of military advisors. By the end of the 1960s, by the end of the Kennedy administration, a graceful pullout of Vietnam was impossible. This was our war. Another example of being saddled with Eisenhower's problems was the Cuban problem. There had been a plan in place since 1960 under Dwight D. Eisenhower to lead 1,200 anti-communist Cuban exiles from Miami and invade the southwest coast of Cuba at a place called the Bay of Pigs. This was a covert operation by the CIA, essentially arming Cuban expatriates. However, it was a complete failure. As the people landed, it turns out that Castro knew they were arriving. People were either arrested or killed upon landing at the Bay of Pigs, and they were found with American plans, American money, American weapons, and Kennedy kind of got a black eye. He's going to be very, very embarrassed by the Bay of Pigs fiasco. 1 year later, in 1962, U-2 spy planes flying over Cuba discovered that the Soviet Union, headed by Nikita Khrushchev, was putting missiles 90 miles off of Florida on Cuba's coast. Another massive embarrassment to the president. In the midst of an election year, Kennedy is tasked with having these missiles removed. A massive embargo over Cuba happened, an embargo that continued all the way through to the Obama administration at some level. Khrushchev had declared that the Monroe Doctrine was dead and that he was able to put these weapons there with his communist partner in Latin America, in Cuba. In the end, Photographs were put before the United Nations. The United Nations kind of scolded the Soviet Union for this, and a deal was made where publicly the U.S. agreed never to invade Cuba again, and the Soviet Union dismantled their intermediate range weapons and took them off Cuba. And secretly, the U.S. agreed to remove their missiles from Turkey that were capable of reaching the Soviet Union. Aside from the Vietnam War, probably nothing screams 1960 more than the Civil Rights Movement. And to me, the kind of pinnacle of the Civil Rights Movement was the sit-in movement. While this had been going on since the late 1930s at different times, the most famous of the sit-ins starts in 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina. Several young African American students were upset that the Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina was a segregated facility. And these heroic black students walked up to that lunch counter and they just grabbed a seat. Now, this is a peaceful protest. This is civil disobedience at its absolute grandest here. They didn't make a scene. They weren't fighting. They went up there and they ordered their food. And when they were told that they couldn't eat in there, they had to go to the window and order, and they could eat their hamburger out on the curb. They said, "No, ma'am, we're not doing that," and they just took up space. And the argument here was, we're violating your unjust law, but we're doing it peacefully. Well, the radio stations picked up on it, and within a few days, more people showed up, and it spread all the way throughout the South as people just peacefully took up space. It made the people who complained about it look even more ridiculous as they lost their cool, as they lost their temper, as these young civil rights volunteers, some of which were even white college students, took up space there, and they were called names. They were every derogatory term you could imagine was yelled at them. They had food dumped on them, and they sat there and took it because they wanted to look like the bigger people. This is the lesson we need to learn about how to protest. The Supreme Court had ruled as early as 1946 in Morgan versus Virginia, and then they strengthened it in the Boynton versus Virginia 1960 decision, which ruled that segregated public buses were unconstitutional. This was an important decision. It had ruled that the Plessy v. Ferguson separate but equal doctrine that had been the rule in the South was unconstitutional, and all of these bus facilities had to desegregate. Well, in the South, they ignored those laws. They continued to have whites-only bus stations where blacks would be forced to sit outside. So organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee, SNCC, got together and organized these busloads of people to go down south and I won't say forcefully desegregate, but willfully desegregate these racist bus systems. Oftentimes they were met with violence. Police chiefs would arrest them for trespassing. They would also oftentimes be met by angry white mobs who didn't like the desegregation laws. And in at least one case, one of these buses was lit on fire while people were still in it. These people who willfully, of their own accord, put themselves in danger in order to prove a point that segregation was discrimination and wrong are heroes, in my opinion. James Meredith is one of those forgotten civil rights leaders in most of our history books. While he had been a writer and a political activist, even got himself shot on a march at one point, what he's most famous for was being the person that in 1962 decided to apply for admittance into the University of Mississippi. That might not be a big deal, but in 1962, the University of Mississippi was still ignoring the desegregation laws of the Brown versus Board of Education case a decade earlier. Meredith ends up being inspired by John F. Kennedy and wants to test this problem here with the University of Mississippi. And he's actually turned down twice for admittance for being black. And a third time, the governor went so far as to pass a law saying that no one who had been convicted of a crime would be eligible for admittance into the university. And the same day, they charged Meredith with the crime of registering to vote illegally. Turned out it was a scam. He was perfectly legitimate in where he registered to vote. It's going to cost in excess of $4 million. It's going to require the Mississippi National Guard being nationalized. But Meredith becomes the first black man to go to the University of Mississippi, and he desegregates that school and is kind of a hope to everyone. Medgar Evers is another related civil rights leader. He was actually the leader of the NAACP that had orchestrated the University of Mississippi challenges. As this massive civil rights leader, he fought starting basically in 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education decision to test all these schools in Mississippi. The result of this was that in 1963, outside of his own home, he was assassinated by a man named Byron de la Beckwith. Beckwith was a member of the White Citizens Council of Jackson, Mississippi, and he assassinated Medgar Evers in order to stop any kind of civil rights. It, in fact, doesn't have that effect on him. In the end, Medgar Evers is recognized as a hero. However, there were two cases of all-white juries, and in both cases they failed to reach a verdict of guilty against Beckwith. He wasn't convicted until 1994, when a new state jury was called with new evidence, and Beckwith was finally found guilty of the murder of Medgar Evers. The most famous of our 1960s civil rights heroes has to be Martin Luther King Jr. MLK was a Christian pastor inspired by the words of Jesus and inspired by Mahatma Gandhi and the principles of equality, but getting equality through civil disobedience. That if a law is unjust, it is your job to disobey that law. He becomes most famous starting in 1955 with the Montgomery bus boycotts, where he organized African Americans to refuse to ride the buses. This was an economic boycott. It was a way of bringing the bus company to its economic needs. Again, this all started with Rosa Parks, and we talked about her in the last lecture. He gave his famous I Have a Dream speech in 1963 in the March on Washington. There's a picture of the March on Washington right here. And MLK is kind of the most important leader, although he did have enemies, including Herbert Hoover and the FBI, which we know recorded him, tried to blackmail him. At one point, there's some evidence that they even sent a letter to MLK saying that he should shoot himself, he should commit suicide, or pictures of an affair would come out. Ultimately, MLK is going to be assassinated on April 4th, 1968 by James Earl Ray, kind of ending this glorious period of civil disobedience and ushering in the Black Power movement with people like Malcolm X as their leader. What for me was the lowest point of the civil rights movement happens in 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama, the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. Several members of a local Ku Klux Klan branch planted at least 15 sticks of dynamite in the basement of the 16th Street Baptist Church. They had a timing device that was set to go off, and there's question as to whether it was intentionally done at this time or they thought it would be empty, but it goes off while some kids were in there having choir practice, and 4 young African American kids were killed at the 16th Street Church in Birmingham, Alabama. Terrible, terrible occasion. In November of 1963, John F. Kennedy was getting ready to launch his re-election campaign. His numbers were squandering a little bit. They were a little lower than they'd like to be. In places like Texas, they weren't as high. So Kennedy decided to come to Dallas, Texas, to uh, appear in an open carriage and kind of try and fire up his base. Um, there's a great picture of him. He's in an open carriage with his wife, Jackie Kennedy. In front of him is the governor, Governor Connolly, and Governor Connolly's wife. And because they wanted this to be a chance to uh, get in touch with the people, Kennedy refused to allow the carriage to be closed. Um, while he was going near the interstate coming out of downtown from the Texas School Book Depository building, Lee Harvey Oswald fired, shooting both Governor Connolly and killing the president. President was rushed off to the hospital. He died shortly thereafter, and Oswald was arrested hiding in a theater pretty nearby. Now we'll never know why Lee Harvey Oswald shot Kennedy, although there's a lot of speculation. Lee Harvey Oswald was a communist sympathizer. He had actually tried to immigrate to Cuba at one point. He did not like Kennedy at all. But before we got an explanation out of him, while Kennedy was being carried between the jail and the courthouse, a nightclub owner from Dallas, a guy named Jack Ruby, came out from the crowd and fired, killing Lee Harvey Oswald. So now the killer of the president is dead, leaving only Jack Ruby to tell the story. And Jack Ruby himself dies shortly thereafter of cancer in a hospital, leaving lots and lots of questions about exactly what happened with the Kennedy assassination. With the assassination of President Kennedy, Texan Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson is sworn in. He's sworn in almost immediately while still in Texas with the First Lady Jackie Kennedy and the new First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson, by his side. Johnson is an interesting character. He and Kennedy had not gotten along very well anyway. He was an old school politician, very much in the vein of a Franklin Roosevelt. In fact, just as Franklin Roosevelt was known as FDR, Lyndon Johnson was known as LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And while a member of Congress, he was known for doing what they called the Johnson treatment, which is, he was a rather large, imposing man. And Johnson would use his physical proximity to kind of force people into his will. And he was really good at managing Congress. Well, now he's the president, and his ability to manage Congress is going to be greatly tested. Even though LBJ and Kennedy were vastly different people, he is going to announce very quickly that he's going to consider his term a completion of Kennedy's term, and he's going to carry on with what he believes America wants with Kennedy's plan. He's going to keep Kennedy's tax cut. Thank heavens he did. It spurred the economy. But he's also going to declare a new war. This time it's going to be a war on poverty. And this was Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. This was Lyndon Johnson, the old school teacher from the 1930s coming out. He had taught school down in the valley in Texas, near the Mexican border, and had seen poverty up close his whole life. And he had a lot of compassion for that kind of people. He had a lot of compassion for the poor. And people were surprised that this gruff-spoken Texan also seemed to have compassion for minorities. He did meet with Martin Luther King after Kennedy's death upon his accession to the office of president, and he pushes through the Civil Rights Act. He pushes through this legislation to give more rights to blacks. Johnson is going to be remembered as a hero to African Americans for this reason. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson decides to seek the presidency in his own right. He receives the nomination from the Democratic Party. His opponent will be conservative, stalwart Republican Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater was the small government conservative Republican that inspires people like Ronald Reagan later on. He's very much in that vein. And he didn't like Johnson at all. In fact, his campaign slogan was, "In your heart, you know he's right." It's a terrible campaign slogan. Lyndon Johnson kind of pokes fun at it. He gets a plane with a banner that follows the Barry Goldwater plane around, and it just says, "In your guts, you know he's nuts." And he kind of preached that Goldwater was going to be a warmonger, and that if you elect a Goldwater, your kids are going to die in battle. Your kids are going to die everywhere. Goldwater is going to use the atomic bomb. The best example of this is the Daisy ad. Probably the most effective campaign ad in history. You might want to go on YouTube and look it up one day and watch it. It starts off with this little girl, and she's got a flower, and she's picking them off, and she's just kind of counting 1, 2, 3, the flower petals as she pulls them off. It looks adorable. And then the voice changes, and it becomes this metallic voice, and you hear a countdown down. And it ends with a mushroom cloud and vote Johnson, vote Lyndon Johnson. The message here was, if you vote for Goldwater, you're voting to kill babies. You're voting to have nuclear war. Johnson only had to pay to run that ad one time, and it was picked up by the news, and he got free media out of it afterwards because it was such a controversial ad. Goldwater ended up losing the election terribly. Johnson gets reelected in his own right. Just as Kennedy inherited the Vietnam War from Eisenhower, Johnson's going to inherit it from Kennedy. And he's going to start a process of escalation. He's going to start sending more and more troops in. Again, not wanting to be the first American president to lose a war. This is all going to hit probably its high point with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. 2 American destroyers were apparently fired upon by North Vietnamese ships. Now, there is some question about the veracity of these claims, but these 2 destroyers claim to have been fired upon. Johnson goes to Congress, and he gets Congress to give him the Gulf of Tonkin resolutions, which granted the president almost unlimited power. The president has the power to, quote, "take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression." This is kind of what we call the blank check. This allowed the president to fight the war without congressional approval. People are going to hate this around the world. They're going to see the U.S. as warmongers, so much so that France is even going to expel the Peace Corps from their country. The great irony of this is that we got into the Vietnam War in the first place because we were helping France with what was then called the French Indochina War. So the Gulf of Tonkin resolutions expanded presidential power greatly. Until 1968, I think there was still hope that the U.S. could win the Vietnam War. But over Tet, which is Chinese New Year, it's kind of like the Vietnamese or Chinese version of Christmas, I guess is the closest thing we could see. The North Vietnam attacked on more than 100 cities and outposts in South Vietnam all at one time. This was an attempt to break the backs of the South Vietnamese, break their will to fight, and they're attacking South Vietnamese, U.S. Army troops, and any other allies that are there. The Tet Offensive was incredibly effective, even more so with the American public than it was against the military. By this point, the American public was against the war. The American college student and teenagers had turned against the war because they were getting drafted for this. They were standing outside the White House chanting, "Hell no, we won't go." It was an awful time period, very, very hard on President Johnson, and eventually it's going to lead to what we call the abdication of LBJ. Even though Lyndon Johnson was eligible for another term, since his first term was just the completion of Kennedy's term, he could have ran again. he surprises everybody when he goes on television and says, "I shall not seek nor will I accept my party's nomination for the office of President of the United States." We call this the abdication. And this leaves it wide open on who's going to be the Democratic nominee. The frontrunner is Robert Kennedy, the brother of former President John F. Kennedy. But Robert Kennedy himself is shot on June 5th, 1968 by Sirhan, leaving the pathway open for Hubert Humphrey. Why this is interesting is because Hubert Humphrey is going to be the Democrat and Richard Nixon is going to be the Republican nominee. Both of those people are the people that Kennedy had defeated to become president. Kennedy had defeated Humphrey to get the Democratic nomination, and then had defeated Nixon for the presidency. In this case, Richard Nixon is going to win the election of 1968, largely through what he called his silent majority. This large swath of Americans that were just looking for a change. They just wanted a return to something, a golden age in the past. They wanted to return to the days of Eisenhower. And Nixon was, of course, Eisenhower's vice president. So let's analyze LBJ. LBJ is surprisingly had his reputation kind of rebuilt over the years. He was a president that had compassion for the poor, had compassion for minorities, compassion for the ill-educated. His first 3 years, the Great Society years, were comparable to the New Deal years of Franklin Roosevelt. And had we stopped there, I think LBJ would be remembered as a truly great president. However, Vietnam is the yardstick that we judge Lyndon Johnson by. And the fact is, he did too much military involvement for the doves, for the peace lovers, and too little for the war hawks. By straddling that middle ground and trying to make everybody happy, Lyndon Johnson actually upset everybody. And shortly after leaving the presidency, Lyndon Johnson dies largely in disgrace. Even his own party had lost faith in him. Lyndon Johnson it's going to be decades before Lyndon Johnson is remembered as probably a better than average president. So if I had to summarize the 60s, I would say that the 60s was a time of civil rights struggles, a time where America woke up and realized we weren't just having a war against Vietnam, we were having a war against embedded racism, a war against poverty. It's the time period when Social Security was expanded, when Medicare and Medicaid were expanded. It's a time period with a growing dependence on the government, and that's evident through cyclic poverty. It's also a time of counterculture with a large youthful population, the baby boomers coming of age. The 3 Ps are how we always say it: a youthful population, a time of protest, and a belief in permanent prosperity. Those are all going to be tested in the 1970s, when everything kind of seems to start getting stagnant.